lend you a coat. And also the sun's blocking here a little bit. You might want to move, you know, if it's going to be too bad. We'll try to draw the drapes here in a minute. We are delighted to have the Helen Suzman exhibit with us. We've been wanting to bring it here for a long time. And this particular exhibit, and tonight, is sponsored by the Friends of the Weinberg Library, the Schimmel Forum, and the Office of Equity and Diversity on the campus. So we particularly enjoy partnering together in terms of bringing these kinds of exhibits to the university and to this beautiful space. I mean, what better space could you do it in than right here? So it's my pleasure now to introduce, who's going to introduce our speaker, who can't see right now. It is better up here, I promise you. Sandra Myers, who's the director of the Schimmel Forum. Thank you.
If anyone feels like moving or needs to because of the sun, feel free to do so. On behalf of the Schimmel Forum and the Friends of the Weinberg Library, I'm pleased to introduce tonight's guest speaker, a woman who in many ways walks in the shoes of Helen Suzman. Perhaps it is presumptuous of me to make that statement, as I have known Fran Bluntman for all of 3 hours, and my acquaintance with Helen Suzman goes back some 31 years. So we'll just leave it at that for now. We see from this exhibition that Helen Suzman was a pioneer, as a woman, as a Jew, as a public leader in a nation that was in what one might say a pathological state of social injustice. She was a reformer, respected the rule of law, and therefore willing to enter the public sphere and serve in the parliament, where she was, at least in theory, in a position to amend the law. Helen was a passionate reformer of prisons in a nation that found all too many innocent people incarcerated. We Americans, I believe, have an issue with incarceration as well, but we can talk about that later. Fran Bluntman is a South African woman and a Jew whose research focuses on criminal justice and punishment in particular. She's an assistant professor of sociology at the George Washington University, who uses her research and teaching not only to enlighten her students, but to inspire them to become informed and engaged citizens, agents of constructive change. On a personal note, as I mentioned earlier, Maury and I had the opportunity to meet Helen Suzman on our first visit to South Africa in 1979. Our trip was a personal exploration of apartheid on the ground, as it were. Our first stop on that journey was the South African Council of Churches, then led by Bishop Desmond Tutu. Although Bishop Tutu was out of the country when we arrived, his deputy director welcomed us with open arms, as South Africa was not exactly a touristic haven at that time. He immediately asked us whom we wanted to meet. We had a long list of people we wanted to meet, but we started with Helen Suzman. He immediately called Helen to say that he had some very good friends in his office who wanted to meet with her. She replied, "Have them come for cocktails tonight at 6. And so we did, and that began one of the most interesting journeys of our life. But we have a lot of interesting journey to hear about tonight. Fran has interviewed Helen Suzman for her own work and is superbly equipped to give insights into this pioneer for social justice and her legacy. Please join me in welcoming Fran Bluntman.
I think that is the most generous and no doubt the most overstated, but nevertheless very touching introduction I've ever had, so thank you so much. And I want to thank Sandra Myers for inviting me. I want to thank someone who's not here, but who put us together, Elzbieta Martinia, who, as I say, made the connection and has recently visited here. And I also want to thank the University of Scranton and all the partners within the university who sponsored this for having the exhibition, and say that I think it's really very impressive and very moving that you're interested in keeping this history alive. And I think what I want to try and do is speak not just to the importance of the history, but to the importance of the continuing legacy and lessons. You know, why should we care about a person, however wonderful she might have been, who defied a system that frankly is dead and gone? You know, she succeeded, wonderful, fabulous, let's get on and, you know, the next thing. And what I want to suggest is that not only should that history in the person of Helen and the struggle she fought and joined with others in fighting be celebrated in its own right, but we should also really look to the legacy she continues to offer. And for me, it can be summarized in one of two ways. The one is one of my favorite expressions, which I think is very much an African-American one, but has universal value, which is speaking truth to power. She was really a woman who spoke truth to power, a power who did not want to hear it, to say the very least. And also, and perhaps because I've recently been reading the story to my children, she was a person who was prepared to say the emperor has no clothes at a time where the emperor was quite convinced of his own magnificence and the magnificence of his suit of clothes. And if there's anything every single one of us can stand to benefit from and share it with our friends, our families, our students, our professors, our neighbors, is that we all need to do a whole lot more of saying when the emperor has no clothes. And in each one of these panels that you see here, I think you can find an instance of this rather small but incredibly powerful, thoughtful, intelligent person being prepared to say the emperor had no clothes, including when she was, like the child in the crowd of the story, the only one saying it. But unlike the story, where the emperor was really foolish but benign, the regime she was saying had no clothes was anything but benign. And although it did not harm her personally, she certainly lost her right to privacy. Her phone and her mail were always tapped. She knew the eyes of the state were constantly upon her. And she sacrificed what could have been a life of just great privilege, great pleasure, to do the right thing. And while nowadays even her former enemies admire her for doing the right thing, she was certainly vilified at the time, and the number of people who recognized the extraordinary contribution she made were few and far between. And I think it's important to remember just how scary that regime was, just how unbenign that emperor was. When we talk about apartheid, certainly, you know, I teach undergraduates, well, graduates too, but in the United States, and it's often tempting and in some ways accurate to compare apartheid to Jim Crow segregation in the South. But there are a number of important differences, and I think the first thing to say about apartheid was how absolutely comprehensive it was as a system of power of a minority over a majority, and a power that was expressed itself socially, politically, economically, really in every sphere of life, so that literally from the moment somebody was born, their race was determined by law, and that assigned their life possibilities in terms of the jobs they could get, the persons that they could have sex with, the places they could live, the schools they could go to. It really affected every aspect of their lives. And it was complete and thoroughgoing. There was no end to that. And while it affected all South Africans, of course, it above all affected black South Africans, who were the victims and the targets of this very comprehensive system. But I think something else to remember about the apartheid state, which is true of any abusive system of power, I think, is that when you have prejudice and when you have abuse of power, it's seldom singular. So while racism was for good reason, what everybody focused on when they talked about the apartheid state, it's after all was its defining feature, it wasn't the only way in which it was repressive and rights denying and abusive. It was also abusive in economic ways. Capitalism was used as a tool not to enable people to go up the ladder, but rather to control people. It's no coincidence that Helen Suzman's interest in apartheid, or awareness in how it was affecting her country people, came out of its economic consequences, because she saw how apartheid was being used to build the economic system in ways that completely dehumanized the very people that were creating the wealth in the society. Interestingly, unlike many of her contemporaries who made that observation, she continued to support capitalism and support a liberal capitalist vision rather than going to a social democratic or a socialist or communist idea, because she saw the potential capitalism had for being something different to what it was under apartheid. Again, speaking to the complexity with which she saw the world. But she was quite happy to engage with people to her left and to her right in discussing these kinds of issues. She also, although she was not a religious Jew herself, was keenly aware of the reality of anti-Semitism, while in later periods the apartheid state came to be a rather good friend of Israel, and that could be the subject of a whole nother discussion. It had at best ambivalent feelings about Jews, and Helen Suzman was constantly vilified both behind her back and to her face for the fact that she was Jewish and faced anti-Semitic threats. And apartheid South Africa was also fiercely sexist. I always joke that the reason I got a Ph.D. was I was sick of government employees and society in general insisting that I either had to be Miss or Mrs. And I said, well, the only way I'm going to convince them I'm not Miss or Mrs. is to become a doctor. And seeing as I was pretty lousy at biology, I had to go the academic route, and as my own personal protest to the entrenched sexism. But if you have a look at the photos of Helen Suzman, whether she was with her black or white friends or enemies, they were almost always men. She was very much alone in that context. And although I don't think she ever defined herself as a feminist, certainly in my definition she was, and she fought as much for women's equality as for the equality based on race. And that was also a fight that needed to be fought. So what was so remarkable about her, in terms of, if you want to try and describe this complex and grand legacy of extraordinary hard work at the grassroots, answering constituent letters and phone calls and speaking to meetings of constituents, just like a congressperson here, she had to get elected, and she had to do all the things any politician has to do to get elected. And the fact that she was representing a privileged white minority didn't mean she didn't still have work to do on their behalf, but also because she was first a lone voice and then a minority voice standing up for the oppressed and the disenfranchised. She became the representative writ large for all the people in the country. And so as a representative, she had to really do constituent service for millions of people, quite literally. And so she was a very hard worker, among her many other qualities. And so she worked on many different levels, and she recognized and appreciated that apartheid was a system that needed to be challenged on multiple fronts. So while many of the people on the left of Sussman saw little or no place for Parliament, she correctly, and I think rather bravely and presciently, recognized there was a place for Parliament. Although in many ways it was a very discredited institution, it was a place where she could get information that other people could not get. It was a place where she could speak about things using her parliamentary privilege and immunity that others could not speak about. She could use her fact of being a parliamentarian to visit prisoners, to speak to foreign dignitaries, to get access to information others could not. And I think it's quite hard to really sort of capture the two very separated divides she was standing on in many ways for many years, where on the one hand she was recognizing the legitimacy of the state, a state she opposed, enough to be in Parliament, and at the same time, on the other side, working to challenge the legitimacy of that same state and that same system, all the while being challenged from all sides. The challenges and where they came from rose and fell at different times in different places. And interestingly, the leadership of the black opposition always had a greater appreciation for her role than many people at the grassroots did. So Nelson Mandela, for example, never doubted for an instant that she was doing the right thing by being in Parliament, while many young radicals on the street might have, because Parliament was a tool of the oppressor. And it was. It was both. It was a place where she could voice opposition and help out the resistance, but it was also a way to legitimize the system. And she had no illusions about the fact that the state could and did try and bolster its democratic image to the world by pointing to her and the fact that she had the freedom to speak. But she did not let that stop her from speaking. Rather, she used it as a tool to try and expand opportunities for others. And she was very willing to work with people across the spectrum, from the right to the left, on an as-needed basis. It wasn't in the sense of what we might think of today in Washington, of bipartisanship. It wasn't like the Nationalist Party architects of apartheid were going to negotiate with her. That wasn't the case, but rather that she needed information from them, and she needed to be cordial enough to be able to visit their prisons. And she knew how to do that. She worked with the ANC, she worked with the Pan-Africanist Congress. She was asked to speak at the funeral of the Pan-Africanist Congress leader, Robert Sobukwe, despite the fact that the PAC had a reputation of being anti-white. But she had been one of the longtime supporters of Sobukwe and his family. When Winnie Mandela was banished to the rural hinterland, Helen Suzman was one of the few people who kept in contact with her and could provide her some protection and some contact with the outside world, as well as some resources for her children and her family. Now, Sandra mentioned something that I think is tremendously important, which was, and that is insufficiently recognized, I think, as one of Helen Suzman's legacies, which is Helen Suzman's role in promoting prison reform. And while many of the issues she has supported and favored over the years have now become commonplace and universally accepted wisdom, I think in the United States as much, and sometimes even more so as in South Africa, the need to address issues of prison reform remains a burning issue, remains an issue that, maybe a better way of putting that, should be a burning issue, but is not. It remains either ignored or unpopular. And I want to suggest that while we can maybe check off sexism, check off anti-Semitism, check off racism on the to-do list, yes, you know, we're one with her, we can still take a leaf from her book on prison reform. In today's lexicon and today's parlance, she would have been someone who would have been both tough on crime but also smart on crime. And part of being smart on crime was taking issues of rehabilitation and the rule of law seriously. And she truly was a leader in advancing prison reform. I want to share with you a couple of quotes about her, first from the 1960s and then from the 1980s. And they are, that timing is not incidental. Let me just find my page. Oh no. The first was, after her first visit to Robben Island, the political prison where most of the black male political prisoners, including most famously Nelson Mandela, were incarcerated. And she was the only woman to actually visit the inmates inside the cells, as opposed to wives who could visit them in the visiting area and lawyers who could visit them in the visiting area, and was certainly for many years the only parliamentarian who ever engaged in any prison visits, particularly to political prisoners. But she didn't only focus on political prisoners, but certainly that's where a lot of her initial understanding of the way the prison system did and didn't work came from. Anyway, after her first visit, she had learned from the inmates that there was a particularly brutal, in American terms, correctional officer, in South African terms, warder, prison warder, who was open in his expressions of support for the Nazis, and in fact had a swastika tattoo. And so she went to speak to the Minister of Prisons about this very brutal warder who was beating up prisoners on Robben Island. So his name was Piet Pelser. So she said, after her first visit to Robben Island, Helen Suzman contacted the then Minister of Justice, Piet Pelser, to ask him to remove this abusive warder who had a swastika tattooed on his hand. The exchange between Suzman and Pelser is revealing about, I think, how incredibly clever she was at using the very limited tools she had. This was at the height of the worst days of apartheid in 1966. She went to him and said, "There's a man in charge of those prisoners who shouldn't be a prison warder at all, but under no circumstances should he be in charge of those political prisoners on the island. This man professes to be a Nazi, has a swastika tattooed on the back of his hand, and is giving them, the political prisoners, a very hard time indeed." This was a rank understatement. "What's more, I'm going to raise this in Parliament under your vote." "That's dynamite, Helen," he replied. "You mustn't do that." "I know it's dynamite," she replied. "It will be headline news all over the world. You had better do something about the border." Suzman's ploy was effective, and within 2 weeks, the man was removed. Earlier on, Professor Fredericks and I were talking about the fact that the prison system in South Africa was incredibly backwards in international terms. In some ways, it's very progressive, and in some ways remains incredibly backwards. That is yet another topic we could talk about. I'm a professor. I like to talk about lots of things. It's sort of occupational hazard. But what I mentioned to him after he'd seen how awful the prisons were, even in 1980s, that already by the 1980s, the improvements had been huge, absolutely huge. And Helen Suzman was a very important part of those improvements. And so the second quote I want to give you is from the then commissioner of, the Commission of Prisons of the late 1980s and the early 1990s, a man named Henk Brain. And he said, and he was talking about the improvements in the prisons. And he said, and I give her credit for a lot of that, and he was talking about Helen Suzman. A lot of changes that took place in correctional services or in the prison services at the time can be ascribed to what she'd been doing. especially at the time that I was down there in the parliamentary office. And that was he was in the parliamentary office at the time that P.W. Botha, her absolute nemesis of nemesis, she had many nemesis, but he was like the biggest of the baddest, or the baddest of the biggest, whatever. And Henk Brain actually was working as like a special assistant to Botha, and nevertheless, despite this hostile relationship, she continued to exert pressure all the way and got results. And when your enemy says you've achieved results, I think there's seldom greater credit than that. And I must emphasize that in speaking to former political prisoners, people who had once been political prisoners across the political spectrum, to a man, and they all spoke about how important and valuable her influence were. People who might have disagreed with her politics somewhat or completely, nevertheless recognized and valued her enormous contribution. Consistent with her open-mindedness and consistent with her being, as I say, to borrow contemporary lexicon, being smart on crime as well as tough on crime, one of her very unusual stands, I think, in international terms, in South African terms, in American terms, that she took was in 1998, she signed an internationally supported open letter to then Secretary General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan. It was printed in newspapers around the world. I think I saw it in the New York Times, actually, at the time, challenging the UN's increasing involvement in the global war on drugs. And all the signatories, of which she was the only South African, argued that the global war on drugs was causing more harm than drug abuse itself. She and the other signatories had no illusions about about the threat of drugs. They weren't supporters of drugs. Rather, they saw the incredible danger of the war on drugs. And this was in 1998. At the time, Colombia, was the killing fields of the drug war. Today, it's Mexico in the killing fields of the drug war. And I have to tell you, to put on my professorial hat, it's amazing when I speak to my students and I ask, do you know what's happening in Mexico? And do you know, in whose name it's taking place? They look at me with blank stares. And I say, do you know how many people have died in Mexico and how many died in Colombia before them? Mostly to support our drug habits, our war on drugs, our addiction to the war on drugs, and so on. I don't know what the answers are, but I do know it's important to ask those hard questions, as she did. By happy coincidence, soon after she signed the statement, I happened to bump into her at a lecture at a university in Johannesburg, and I went up to her. I reintroduced myself. Of course, she didn't remember me, or at least I doubt she did, and said to her I'd recently seen that she had signed this statement, and I wanted to congratulate her. I thought it was great, and I was very pleased that there was at least a South African representative among the world dignitaries who had signed this international statement. And her response was, "Of course I signed it, particularly this attitude to marijuana. I just don't understand it. Every night I have my scotch." After all, Sandra had been invited for cocktails. "Every night I have my scotch. I don't see why somebody else should be deprived their joint if that's their pleasure." And this incredibly unique, iconic, spirited, funny, witty woman just had such a fierce spirit of independence that it's hard to describe, but I want to, in my final comment, which I'll give in just a moment, share another lovely story that spoke to that. But before departing on that lovely story, I want to emphasize that Helen Suzman was a woman of privilege. And I would suspect in many, many ways, all of us, without knowing any of your backgrounds and without you knowing much about mine, are all people of privilege in some way. My own definition of privilege is any of us who have any choice are privileged. Most of the people in the world have no choice about almost everything, and sometimes everything in their lives. Those of us who have any degree of choice, I think, fall into the realm of the privilege. That's my own definition. And she was a woman of particularly high privilege. She could have just enjoyed the pleasures of South Africa, and they are great indeed, especially of the time and place she was in. She could have gone overseas and enjoyed the world stage. She was very smart, witty, ambitious, you know. But instead, she committed herself to an unpopular cause. And she was one of those lucky people in that she came to see the success of what she did in her lifetime. But there's no guarantees of that when one takes on an unpopular cause. And we all need to find, you know, what is that cause that needs greater support for us? It'll be different for different people, that deserves in some way, shape, or form our support, even if it does make us being that lone voice saying the emperor has no clothes. But although she could say the emperor has no clothes to some of the most vicious and violent people and leaders the world has known, I think, she also knew how to enjoy life's pleasures. And that's the final story I want to tell you. At the same time as standing up to power, I had the enormous, amazing, wonderful privilege of having the launch of my book on what was then the recently built Constitutional Court in South Africa. And of course, in this magnificent and very interesting building, it was self-consciously built on the site of a former jail to precisely make a distinction between what was and what the Constitutional Court aimed to produce. In this very auspicious building with this great history and great art, of course there were no drinks allowed. And so although it was quite a chilly winter's night, we had to have the wine and cheese outside and people had to leave that behind when they came inside. And the guards were understandably rather strict on this rule, you know, no refreshments in the foyer of this grand building, except for Helen Suzman. And Helen Suzman wandered in and had her glass in hand, and then proceeded to open up her purse and take out a little whiskey bottle, the kind that you would get on an aeroplane. Now, bear in mind, I was the sort of host, you know, so she wasn't afraid to say that the emperor has no clothes to anybody and everybody. And she said, you know, I have to bring my own scotch. I know that these kinds of affairs, they only ever give you cheap wine. I can't abide the stuff. And she proceeded to pour her scotch and stand there and drink it before I gave my little presentation. And when I heard that she died, all I could think of was her standing in the Constitutional Court foyer, drinking her scotch, and I wanted to say, cheers, l'chaim, and a luta continua to her, and long may we all carry her lessons forward, whether it is with or without our glass of scotch. I was unusually well behaved and not talking too much, so that if there were any comments or questions, you should all feel free to ask them. And if any of you have, you know, personal stories to share, I know some of you might have met her, please feel free to do that.
In 1988, when I was there, there was a controversy about the academic boycott. And in my experience, there were both white and black South Africans who supported it or didn't support it. Since I was there, I didn't think it was a good idea. But my question is whether you know whether Helen Suzman supported
She did not support it, and she also did not support divestment and disinvestment in South Africa. It was one of the areas where she came to the greatest tensions with people who she had long stood on the same side of the fence on. And interestingly, she herself became victim of something akin to the academic boycott, where her alma mater, University of Witwatersrand, when I was a student there, many students on the left opposed her speaking because in the 1980s, this was at the height of the conflict, because society had become so polarized, and she was seen as a sort of representative, not of the apartheid state, nobody ever was that ridiculous, but of the status quo in a certain way, in part because of her stand on disinvestment. And people believed that she wasn't sufficiently supportive of divestment, or sufficiently, I think, respectful of the need for an armed struggle. Nobody could come out straight and say they supported the armed struggle, because that was illegal. But I think they expected more understanding from her, and she was pretty critical of violence as a tool. She was critical of divestment and disinvestment, and most certainly of the academic boycott. And she came from an academic context in certain ways. I mean, many of her family members were very highly educated. She had been a lecturer before going to Parliament. And she thought the free exchange of ideas was one of the most important ways to advance democracy. So she would have been delighted that you were there.
Have you noticed on one of the posters that she stood 3 elections when she was the only representative of her point of view in Parliament? Did she have much difficulty in getting support from the people who were actually going to vote for her?
Her constituency was pretty supportive of her, and really held her up. I mean, interestingly, the community she lived in was trying to think of what the equivalent sort of upscale American suburb would be, and I'm sort of failing to think of an appropriate comparison, maybe somewhere in Long Island, I don't know. But it was an affluent, educated, professional, disproportionately Jewish community. It's since become, it's now as if not more affluent, but much more diverse. Mandela has a home there, and many other politicians have, and black business people have homes there. But her constituency was very loyal, which is not to say she didn't have some opponents. No. But
when you look at that string of election victories, it's incredible.
She was very often elected unopposed. I'd have to go back to the record to see when she actually had a competitive election and when she was elected unopposed. But it was mostly unopposed. She was very, very highly respected, but in those narrow confines. And as I say, she was good at constituent services, which is not a bad thing to be if you're a politician.
Had she traveled to other African countries?
That's a fascinating question. I don't know the answer to that. I would suspect not very much, in part because in many ways that wasn't the focus of many African countries to reach out to her or her to reach out to them. In other words, if she wanted to make a pitch for opposing apartheid, she would have come to England or the United States and so on. But I don't know. It's a good question.
And there's so many African communities, South African communities in Zimbabwe, Liberia, Congo, there were communities of rebels.
You mean of anti-apartheid? Yes, but those were people that she wouldn't have been able to be open about working with. So I know, for example, my mother actually was part of an organization called the Five Freedoms Forum, which organized one of the first widespread civil society visits, mostly of white anti-apartheid organizations, to meet with the African National Congress when they were still banned. And my mom actually had asked, in her capacity as representative of that organization, had asked Helen Suzman to go with them. And she said she couldn't because of her parliamentary position, but she said she fully supported that kind of action. She just couldn't do it in her official capacity, but she certainly did unofficially. I mean, she wouldn't, she was, when Mandela, what happened with Mandela is he started negotiating from prison secretly, and then slowly his sort of opportunity to act with the outside world expanded. And she was one of the first people he looked to, and he in turn had these series of sort of behind closed doors ways of communicating with the exiled movement as well as with internal opponents of apartheid. So she might have been somewhat aware of some of those dynamics, but she was from, she was a member of the political party. She wasn't a member of the mass democratic movement, which was the social movement that stood outside of Parliament. But she certainly, within the country, she was always a person who would go to funerals when the police had killed people. And she was always used her person and her status to protect people where she could, even if she didn't share their politics.
The City of Philadelphia awards the Liberty Medal. It's a very prestigious award that is given to international significant people in human rights. In the 1990s, they awarded it jointly to de Klerk and Mandela. It was presented by then President Clinton. The black community of Philadelphia was outraged that de Klerk was identified in the same presentation with Mandela. Two parts to the question. What was Helen Suzman's relationship to de Klerk, and how meaningful was he in eliminating apartheid?
She would have known him fairly well because they were in Parliament together at the same time. However, she resigned more or less around the time he came to run the National Party. Now, the conventional wisdom at the time when he was chosen to replace P.W. Botha as the leader of the National Party, which meant that he was going to be the next president. It's sort of a hybrid of the British and the American presidential prime minister kind of model. It was considered to be a real step backwards because he was considered on the far right of the party. And I suspect she would have agreed with that wisdom of the time, but in fact he turned out to be the sort of the equivalent of Nixon goes to China. He turned out to be this very, very important reformer that was prepared to take steps that nobody else could or would take. I suspect she would have been surprised. Having said that, she also would probably have been more aware than most that his brother was a liberal academic, and that those kinds of things often have surprising influences.
It suggested that the mother influenced him by saying, hey, see how your brother's behaving, and that moved de Klerk somewhat.
Oh, that is not something I'm familiar with. I mean, one of the things I learned in my own research, which was absolutely fascinating, was the enormous power the civil servants in both the intelligence and prison services played in kind of being go-betweens between the Minister of Justice, who of course was a political figure, and Mandela, who was their prisoner. There's a fascinating photo that was taken of Mandela with the Minister of Justice, the Commissioner of Prisons, and the head of National Intelligence, while Mandela was still a prisoner, having a sort of essentially a pre-negotiations negotiations. I think de Klerk was extremely important. One cannot possibly underestimate what he did. History would not have been the same without his move. Having said that, I think it's also important to recognize he didn't act alone. He acted within a context, and perhaps the most important historical dimension of the context was the fall of the Berlin Wall, because something that cannot be, I think, underestimated in explaining the transition from apartheid to democracy is that the National Party really did see a red under every bed. I mean, they were like McCarthy in the 1950s. In some ways, they were colorblind, because instead of seeing black, they saw red. And, you know, I indicated earlier that Sussman was, you know, very much a pro-capitalist figure, but that didn't stop her from being accused of being a communist because she opposed apartheid. And the fact that the Soviet Union was no longer in the position, and therefore no longer in the position to give the ANC and the Communist Party the kind of support it had historically was hugely important in sort of tipping the scales. But de Klerk, I don't believe de Klerk for an instant didn't know about the repression, the torture, the killings that were going on. And I don't buy his or other people's explanations that they were simply, that apartheid was sort of a mistaken but well-meaning program. So, and sort of for full disclosure, when de Klerk was invited to speak at the University of Akron when I was a faculty member there about 10 years ago, and I did write an op-ed in the local paper criticizing a one-sided look at his legacy. But the flip side is one has to appreciate him. In other words, I am going to call his role in the human rights abuses in general and in particular that I know and suspect are there. But at the same time, I cannot admire Mandela and not give him credit for taking this unimaginable step. It was certainly unimaginable at the time. And giving him credit for that role. It was remarkable. It changed the face of South African history, and I think has contributed to changing world history in certain ways, which doesn't take away his crimes and his sins, but certainly puts him in a completely different level to any of his predecessors, who only are their crimes and sins, in my opinion.
Yeah, I don't understand the objection, her objection, or the objection that you suggest is appropriate to the war on drugs, and because it goes so far beyond that joint or that scotch. So, the drug abuse. Mm-hmm. So, could you help me to understand that?
Well, I don't want to claim to be speaking for her, and because I don't know what her position was on heroin, cocaine, and so on. I suspect her approach would have been something like the approach that's often called harm reduction or harm minimization, that many people argue, that you have to, in a way, pick your battles. And so you might want to decriminalize or maybe even legalize, tax, and regulate marijuana, while be much stricter on cocaine, heroin, and so on. She probably also would have been quite a pragmatist on things like introducing more medical as well as criminal justice interventions for drugs. I mean, one of the remarkable things about the US approach to drugs, especially illicit drugs, is how little we do in resource provision and in outreach to try and help people who are addicted to drugs. So many people argue that some people will never deal with their drug abuse unless there is the threat of criminalization or the reality of criminalization, and certainly I think that that is true for a great many people. So there's a role for criminalization, at least in my opinion. But it's no use putting people in prison without treating the addiction or the broader social factors like poverty and appalling education and so on that contribute to the cycles of addiction. I also think that what that particular statement, in that 1998 statement, was addressing is the fact that US in particular and many other countries' foreign policies were essentially causing countries that were the sources of drugs in terms of essentially private capitalist developers, farmers and manufacturers having the drug trade and using those countries to send the drugs abroad. They wanted those countries to take on those drug lords. And in some ways that's valid, and in some ways it's not, because it means the people of those countries have to suffer the worst consequences. Literally in Mexico, Colombia, and elsewhere. You're talking people have died in the tens of thousands in these wars on drugs, and it's if we can use the metaphor of war, it's a kind of collateral damage we don't see and we don't recognize. Professor Friedrichs made mention of my very esteemed colleague Bill Chambliss, who is a very, very esteemed criminologist, and he would go much further, and he would say the US government has been very complicit in Central America, in Afghanistan and elsewhere, in actually using drug lords and the drug trade to support foreign policy ventures and wars on the one hand, and at the same time fight wars on drugs on the other. If I can put it this way, I think if there's one thing to miss about apartheid, it was the simple, clear-cut battle of good versus evil. Apartheid was evil, and opposing apartheid was good. When I look at the causes that I believe in today, none of them, or few of them, have that kind of clear-cut simplicity. And I think drugs are a very good example. Because I live in a gentrifying neighborhood of Washington that still suffers some of the legacy of drug damage, and some of it has just been moved further down the street. The block that I moved in literally had a crack house on the block for the first few years that I lived there, and I saw how it destroyed the people who were addicted to it. And I was very grateful when a combination of forces led to that house no longer being occupied by crack addicts, but by a very nice yuppies, one of whom works for E-Trade and one of whom is a teacher in one of the charter schools. And I'm immensely grateful. One of the other neighbors said it was like winning the lottery. That's not what I want for myself or my children. At the same time, I also happen to live very near the DC jail. It doesn't seem to me that simply imprisoning the number of people we do in this society is a solution. The United States imprisons more people than any other democracy, and possibly than any other country. How do you trust a country like China's numbers? You can't. And in the federal system, about 50% of those people are there for drugs. And some of them are evil drug lords who are behind this. But some of them are opportunists or fools or unlucky people or minor criminals who were at the wrong place in the wrong time. And somehow it seems that we should be able to have a more complicated answer to such a complicated problem. And I think the Obama administration has made some moves in that direction. And actually the Bush administration before 9/11 showed some signs even of doing that, especially in terms of recognizing the need for rehabilitation to return to prisons. President Bush in his first, is it inaugural? Is that the right word? I just can't think of the English word now. Address actually talked about redemption of of prisoners. And that came, I think, from his own Christian experience, especially his contact with Chuck Colson in Texas. And I think 9/11, took away from those kind of efforts. And it's certainly one of those things when one can forge coalitions and partnerships. But in the end, it's not on most of our radar screens. And I think it should be. And do I have the answer? No. Do I think there is an answer? No. Do I think we need to talk about it and find multiple answers and be prepared to take risks and even fail on the way? Yes, I do, because we are failing in what we're currently doing. I'll get off my soapbox now.
Any other questions? Well, just many, many thanks.
Well, thank you.
Wonderful
This was
presentation.
an honor. Thank you so much.